Welcome to the Evolving Warfighter. My name is Dr. Franklin Annis, and today I have a very special guest with me today. We have a professor from the U.S. Naval War College, so Dr. Pauline Shanks-Kaurin. She is a professor in the College of Leadership and Ethics, once again at the U.S. Naval War College. She holds a doctorate in philosophy from Temple University and specializes in military ethics, just war theory, philosophy of law, and applied ethics. She has numerous publications, including Achilles Goes Asymmetrical, The Warrior, Military Ethics, and Contemporary Warfare. And she's also been published in a number of multiple professional military education journals, which I think is where I stumbled upon you. And I can't remember the name of the essay, but it was about adding ethicists into units like chaplains.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was on my blog, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I thank you very much for being with me today and taking the time with me.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah. So I know that when I reached out with you, I was excited to talk to you about, some type of philosophy and the connection to the military, and you brought up the term ethics of care, and it was honestly nothing that I'd ever heard before, and it kind of got me excited. So we'll just jump right in and say, could you explain what ethics of care is and give a concept of it?
Ethics of care is a tradition within ethics that looks at ethical obligation through the lens of relationships. And it originates with a critique of Lawrence Kohlberg, who's a psychologist, and he has a developmental ethical framework. And one of his students, Carol Gilligan, who wrote a book In a Different Voice, she's also a psychologist. She leveled some critiques of his work on the basis of gender. And feminist ethicists then picked up that dispute and picked up Carol Gilligan's work and started to look at it from the standpoint of philosophy and philosophical ethics. And decided that there was something missing in the traditions of the philosophical traditions of ethics like Kant and utilitarianism, which are the two dominant ones, but also Aristotle, and decided that this idea of ethical obligation on the basis of relationship was something that was actually really important and needed to be treated. And their arguments, they are founded to some degree coming out of Aristotle, but also a Scottish philosopher from the 18th century named David Hume, who argued that empathy was a core piece of ethics. So they're building on his ideas. But what they wanted to argue is that there's something missing, and that to be an ethical person meant you have to, at least in part, think about what are your ethical obligations based on your relationship. So I have ethical obligations to my children that I don't have to you, I don't have to my students, but I also have ethical obligations to you or my students or people who live in my country or people who don't live in my country based on different levels and kinds of relationships. So the argument is we need to think about what those relationships are. The philosophical ethical tradition, especially in the 19th and 20th century, with different versions of Kantian philosophy and utilitarianism, was really focused on justice, and justice as a more sort of impartial, universal, abstract virtue that then you applied to specific situations. And people who are ethicists of care want to argue that, no, you need both justice and care, so that it was sort of a missing piece.
Okay. So this would be an addition to the ethical system you're looking for, not like a solid, hey, we're switching from utilitarianism, we're switching exactly into, or only into ethics of care. So it's something that you'd use in combination?
Yeah, for most, there are some ethicists of care, not very many, but there are a few who would argue that ethics of care is a superior theory, but most of the people who are working out of ethics of care, the dominant figures argue that care is a supplement and
Okay.
needs to be considered alongside conceptions of justice. So it's not necessarily a standalone, but it's to provide a piece of the puzzle that had been missing in the Western philosophical tradition, basically.
Okay. So you brought up Lawrence Kohlberg. Can you mind if I just cover the Heinz Dilemma real fast? So I
Sure,
can give
yeah,
some
go
context?
ahead.
So from what I understand, so Lawrence Kohlberg developed what was called the Heinz Dilemma. So he surveyed a number of boys of various ages to look at their ethical development through as they aged. And he essentially asserted that as we got older, we used different types of ethics. But the large overarching theory is there was a man that had a sick wife. The sick wife needed a drug. The drug was invented by a pharmacist. The pharmacist, I think the number was made the drug for $200, but he wanted $2,000. I
Right.
don't remember the exact amounts, but it was like something like 10 times higher for profit. Essentially, the pharmacist said, hey, I'm only selling this for profit. And then the big moral question became, is it better to let the sick wife die versus would it be ethical to steal the drug?
Right.
So how they approached that situation changed as they aged. And
Right.
I think Carol Gilligan added in that when she presented that same dilemma to, I don't know if it was just one female or several, but she presented the same one to the little girls. Essentially, they were very hesitant to come to an exact conclusion. They were more willing to try like finding alternate solutions like bargaining instead of giving like a definitive answer. And they were more likely to use kind of abstract principles instead of absolutes. Is that,
Yeah,
hopefully that
and
was all correct.
part of what happened in later studies is he did have mixed groups, and one of the things that he found was that it was only the males who were getting to the highest level of ethical development. For some reason, women weren't getting past stage 3 or 4, and part of Gilligan's critique of Kohlberg is that the way that this developmental structure is set up is to privilege abstract principles and to privilege absolutes as the highest form of ethical development, but she argued that that was gendered, that there was a gender problem there, and it wasn't that women were less ethically developed, it's that they approached ethics in a different way.
Okay.
They approached ethics in terms of relationships and saw obligations in terms of their network of relationships and community, as opposed to seeing them in terms of abstract principles or justice conceptions or absolutes. And so what you had was some kind of gender differential. Now, of course, we could have all kinds of discussions about why that was the case. And what feminist ethicists concluded was that that women, whether that's for biological reasons or social reasons or a combination of the two, approached ethics in a different way, and that wasn't being accounted for by the ethical traditions of people like Kant and utilitarianism. So the argument here is that there's a piece that's missing, right?
Okay. Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to add one thing in here, but I've seen one big criticism of this experiment in terms of the fact it's really a false dilemma how it was presented to children. Because
Right.
if you say the only option is to let the wife die or steal, you're eliminating kind of 100 different other options in between. And I think Carol Gilligan's subjects, whether they intended to or not, they broke down the false dilemma to try to find the alternate solutions and kind of really step out of the study, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what that opens up is that people don't think of ethics just in terms of two stark choices, right? It's more complicated than that. And what this study really illuminates is to get us to have a conversation about how people, not just what people decide to do ethically, but how they get there. Like what are they thinking about when they're deciding what to do?
Okay. So you believe this is a good philosophy that could be adapted into the military. Could you kind of give a scenario in a military context of where this might play out, or what type of relationships inside the military this would function at?
Well, I think if you look at the military, it's all about relationships. There's the relationship between the commander and her subordinates. There's relationships between peers. There's the civil-military relationship between the military as an institution and civilians who have control of the military. And in fact, the military profession is defined by a particular kind of relational community that is allowed to do certain things and abides by certain core values and has a certain body of expertise and serves society. So the way military professionalism is defined, the way the profession itself is defined, is in terms of a relationship. And I think if you look at the military, I think people and talk to people, I think people think that care is a basic ethical obligation. So if you talk to people who are in command, they will talk about taking care of their people, right? And that's an ethical obligation. If you think about the relationship between the civilian and the military, there's this notion of a contract, right? That the military serves the civilian leadership, but the idea is that the civilian leadership will take care of the military. It will not waste lives. It will take care of veterans. It will take care of those who are injured. The whole infrastructure of military benefits is built on this kind of notion that we are supposed to take care of the military. So there's all these different kinds of relationships. You look at war literature, one of the big themes in war literature is care for one's comrades, the people that one fights with, right? And, whether it's war literature or the psychological literature of people who study war, when we look at why do people fight, they fight for the man or woman next to them. So it's about a lot of things in the military are about relationship. If we look at Medal of Honor citations, very often when they're going through the heroic acts that were done, you see language about sacrificing for their fellow soldiers or to save someone else. That's all language of care. It's the same kind of language that a parent might use talking about their child, or a friend might use talking about another friend. So I think this, it's not necessarily a view that's been applied to the military quite yet, but I think it's sort of intuitive because so many relationships in the military are about care in some really deep sense. And I'm not just talking about like warm, fuzzy, we like each other, but we think we have ethical obligations to other people based on a particular relationship.
Okay, but very well said. So how do you see the ethics of care best functioning inside the military? So where is it lacking now that you would say, hey, if we could apply it one place, this is where we kind of should start focusing?
Well, I think right now in military ethics, we tend to think of things in terms of what I call the big three. Number one being Kant, so that things are, we decide what to do based on rules or laws. Okay. Number two would be utilitarianism. What's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And then the last one is Aristotle's virtue account. So what would a person of good character do? And I think one way to think about this is to add ethics of care as a fourth option to think through things. But the other way to think about it is Stoicism is very popular with people in the military. And the institution that I teach at is very fond of Admiral James B. Stockdale, who was president at one point. And I think he's actually a great example. He credits philosophy with getting him through his POW experience. But one of the things that he does, and one of the ways to look at what he does, is that he, when he's shot down, he's in command, and it's pretty clear he's going to have to make some decisions. What he does is he develops a community of care around the particular relationships between himself and his men. But he also had to consider other relationships, his relationship with his adversary, with people who are torturing him, his relationship with, his own government, with people back home. So I think that you can take something like Stoicism that we think of, as it's popular with the military. It seems to make intuitive sense, and look at that and say, well, there's a different way to think about what's going on, and that there's these relationships here, and what Stockdale is interested in is preserving those relationships. And I think one of the benefits of ethics of care is that it's messy. It's not clean. And ethical decisions, as you pointed out, are rarely a clean binary between two things, right? He had people that were in his community who broke under torture, and then came back to the community, and he has to think about how to reintegrate them, and what to do with that situation, and how to prepare people for being tortured. That's relational. And this is in a context where they had to develop unique communication skills, right? They had to tap, and they had to have code, and they had to have letter. All of these things are not necessarily the clean scenario case study that you might study in your normal sort of PME. So it gives us a different way to think about some of the things that the military faces that are actually quite complicated, like sexual assault. There's violations of rules, and there's a greater good consideration, there's character, but there's also relationships. There's violations of trust that have happened. The military is really interested in the idea of trust, and trust really is not an abstract ethical principle. Trust is a relationship between two or more people. So it may give us a more nuanced and perhaps a more authentic way to think about these things. And when I've done moral philosophy classes with my students in the past, ethics of care is the one view that they all say, yeah, I can relate to this. This makes sense because it's about my relationships. It's not about these abstract principles.
I think we ran into one of the accused weaknesses of ethics of care, and I think this is a good place as any to ask about it. But so when I think about like virtue-driven ethics, when you apply a virtue, you're attempting to apply it universally. So the concept of justice you could translate into, they say, love equally for every man, where ethics of care seems to be subjective, and I know there's some arguments that say it's not subjective. Could you weigh in and say, would you wager is there a way to say you could apply this concept kind of equally and in a way that would be predictable?
I think you can. I guess I would take exception. I understand where you're coming from, but the idea is that justice or character or the greater good, there's a notion those are objective principles that can be applied objectively. And as soon as you start to talk about case studies, that becomes very complicated very fast. And it's clear that there's subjectivities involved in those as well, right?
Yes.
So I don't think you can avoid, my point is not to diss on those views, but it's to say you can't avoid the subjectivity problem, right?
Yes.
The question is, can you take this and apply it, and I like your question, in a way that's predictable? And I think you can, because we do it all the time with parenting.
Okay.
In our society, we look at people and we say, yes, that standard of care that you are giving your child is good. And there are other standards of care that we say, no, you cannot lock your child in the basement for 12 years. That's not an okay standard of care, right? Now, of course, there are borderline cases and complicated cases where we're going to disagree, but we can make judgments fairly predictably, right? We have a pretty clear body of evidence, especially within a given culture, of what constitutes good care and what constitutes bad care. We also do this with medicine, right? A doctor can tell you, or a nurse can tell you, what constitutes good hospice care or good care for a heart attack patient. So I think some of this is about just embracing that there will be subjectivity, trying to limit it, and then say, okay, what is the caring thing to do given this relationship and given this circumstance, right? We have the same debate when it comes to the same issue with domestic violence. We can look at two people in a relationship and say, these kinds of behaviors are not caring, and these kinds of behaviors are caring, right? Because we're defining what that relationship looks like. And we can do the same thing in the military. There are standards of care that commanders owe the people that they command. We know what those are, right? And we also know what those who are commanded owe to their commanders. So it's just a different way of talking. It's a way of acknowledging that relationship matters, and that ethical obligations very often occur within the context of a relationship. I have ethical obligations to my fellow American citizens in virtue of the relationship we have as citizens. Those are different obligations than I have for my children, right? And so I think that there's different ways to think about this. So I don't think you can get rid of the subjectivity, but I think we can generate some consensus, and there will be borderline cases where we're going to disagree and have to figure out and go back and forth about what constitutes good care. But I think you're going to have borderline cases in ethics anyway. You can't avoid that problem.
Well, yes, and I think that I guess the biggest challenge, regardless of the ethical system that we choose to use, if we look at like the lowest level in the military, say the squad leader level, as long as the squad leader is predictable to say, well, one soldier's having a problem or got in trouble, so this is kind of the standard or approach that's going to be used. If it becomes drastically different for the next individual, then it becomes an issue. And then I guess that was my question when you talk about ethics to the care, and for someone that hasn't studied significantly long into it, if I had a soldier that I've known for years and years, do I show him more care and more attention than the soldier that just reported to my unit? Or is that how you'd have to kind of modify it for the military context?
No, because I think the care is based on the relationship. So I have students who are my students who maybe I've known a couple years, and I have students who just entered my classroom like last week. The length of time is really irrelevant. They are my students, right? Okay. And so it's the student-teacher relationship that generates the ethical obligations. Okay. Right? In the same way, the platoon leader, doesn't matter whether the person is platoon just got there 30 seconds ago or has been there, let's say 6 months or a year or whatever, that's not part of the relationship, or that's a contingent part of the relationship. The relationship is platoon leader to soldier, right? And so there's ways to think about what are the categories of those relationships. And I think if you're a platoon leader, you do have a sense of what your obligations to the people you lead are. I mean, I know talking to Marines, they seem to have a very clear notion of what it is they owe to the people that they lead. So I think, and these are within the military profession, This is part of being a profession. You have conversations about what do these relationships look like and what are the ethical obligations that go with those relationships. That's something for members of the community to talk about and to make decisions about. So that's something that there may be some consensus about, and it may change over time. So if you look back to, the Navy, let's say, in the period right after the Revolutionary War, right, there was a very particular command relationship that people had in mind, and it involved things like rum and flogging, right? That's not, at least to my knowledge, the same relationship. We have a different, you're still in command, you're still the captain of the ship, but there's a different expectation about things like discipline and how you're going to care for your people, right? So these things can evolve over time and they can change, right?
Okay. Yeah, that clarifies kind of what I would have been concerned. So
Sure.
I guess the next question to kind of preface this, it gets back into the subjectivity of we pretend that we're objective, but
Right.
just because of human evolution, we tend to have in-group preferences. So we have a natural preference to people that appear most to us. We're most willing to like risk our lives for our children because we're trying to, it's inbred to us to protect our own genes. And the more a person is connected to you, so if I see a child that's drowning in the stream, the more that child looks like me or is related
Sure.
to me, the more I have a natural biological drive to engage to go save the child's life. And then hopefully as we evolved as a society, we started saying, hey, we're going to base things on reciprocity. So it's not just about, hey, you're in my tribe, it's you're in my society or state or nation, where we can start breaking down and say, hey, we're moving past, appearances or tribal factions, and we're growing a larger society. The question is, does the ethics of care help us kind of escape tribalism, but does it come with the negative consequence of collectivism? So all of a sudden you don't view yourself as like an independent person, separate from the community, kind of like maybe the transcendentalist philosophers would, more
Right.
independent, and you engage when you want to engage in society. But if we apply ethics of care, you're really a sum of obligations to other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would take more of a middle road and say it's both, because I would follow Aristotle and David Hume, who both argued that we are social creatures. So yes, we are individuals, but we are raised and we live in human communities. And there's different levels of human community, including the family and the city and the state and so on. But we're still social creatures, and especially for Hume thought that our emotions were socially oriented, that we have empathy. It's much stronger for, as you said, people who look like us, people who are in the in-group. So you do have that tribal aspect. And I don't know that you can completely sort of get around that. You're dealing with evolutionary biology and psychology there. What Hume says you can do is that you can practice. You can practice entering into the sentiments or the experiences using moral imagination of other people and cultivate empathy for people who are not in your in-group. And who don't necessarily share your experiences, but it has to be an intentional thing that you do, and it takes practice. And we do this with our children, right? So the one sibling, I have two boys, so one of them hits the other one, and I look at the other one and I say, how would you feel if someone did that to you, right? And everyone's mother or father makes them go through this, right? And that's an attempt as parents for us to say, enter into the feelings of the person that you have just harmed and imagine how you would feel if you were harmed. And art and literature, movies, popular culture, all of these artifacts invite us to do that. So when you're watching Titanic, like Jack and Rose are not real. They're not. but we're crying. Why? Because they're evoking a sentiment we can imagine, even though I've never gone down with a ship hit by an iceberg, but the way the story is crafted, I can imagine it. So yeah, I think there's always going to be this pull between tribalism and collectivism, and I think it's about maintaining some kind of creative tension between the two. And I think the people that we look at as moral exemplars, like someone like Mother Teresa, like I think we look at her and say she's a good person because she is able to demonstrate compassion for people who were not from her caste, from her in-group, right? And those people that we think of as moral people are people who are able to reach past that and move beyond that. They're still always individuals, and they're still always a member of their collective or their community, but they're able to sort of move back and forth between the two. And it's challenging. And I think if you take something like the intervention in Rwanda that didn't happen, I think it's pretty clear that's part of what's going on. It's like, well, we can feel bad. That sucks that all those people are killing each other, but I'm not willing to stake my life and my interest to address that harm, right?
Yes.
So, and that's not just we failed to apply a principle of justice, which we did, but there's also this other piece. We have a basic human rights relationship with the other people on this planet that that failed in that case, right? If you're in favor of the intervention, which I was, because it was genocide, right? We decided after 1945 that we have a basic obligation to intervene in cases of genocide, and we failed in that. So it may so there's always going to be this tension, but things like empathy and ethics of care can they can problematize and break down some of that tribalism. It's never going to go away. That's just how we are as humans. But it can also help us to avoid just, I'm a member of this group, and therefore I must do what the group says. Because that's not caring either, yeah. Right? And we've seen, speaking of 1945, right, the Holocaust is a really good example of sort of collectivism gone wrong, right? And those people who didn't follow their collective, it was because they had empathy and they were able to care for people who were not in their in-group, sometimes at very high risk to themselves.
Okay. So are there any, I know that you listed Carol Gerrigan, but are there any foundational books on this actual philosophy or any recommended reading that you'd suggest for anyone interested in going?
Yeah, Virginia Held is a major theorist, and she has an anthology called Justice and Care. That includes pieces by Carol Gilligan and herself. Annette Beyer, who is she's a Hume scholar as well. And then Nell Noddings, who is another major care theorist. But it's really important to bear in mind that there's a multiplicity of views. So care ethics, it's plural because there are different views and different interpretations of what counts as care and how we think about that and how that's supposed to come about. So there isn't just one view, and that's why I like the anthology, because you have a variety of different views.
So this might be a hard question to ask you off the top of your head, but do you feel that there's a single view that's more supportive for the military? I know that's kind of a hard question.
I think probably Virginia Held or Annette Beyer are going to be the ones that are most interested in balancing justice and care. And so I think that's going to be more intuitive to the military than some of the views that are just really more care oriented.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for covering this important topic.
Thank you.
You do some great work, and you're constantly producing material. Could you tell the audience how to find more of your material? I am on Twitter at Pauline Shanks.
I have a chapter in the new book on military professionalism edited by Nate Finney and Ty Mayfield called Redefining the Modern Military. And then, of course, you mentioned my first book, Achilles Goes Asymmetrical. But in 2020, I have a new book on obedience coming out on the U.S. Naval Institute Press, so you can look for that book as well.
Okay, that one sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much for your time. It's been a wonderful chat.
Thank you.
For the audience out there, I invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more videos on the topic of military self-development and military history. And thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you, man.